Have you ever wondered how exactly did our ancestors measure and keep time? For us, with our modern alarm clocks and phones and watches, it's rather simple. But even if all of our clocks suddenly disappeared, we can still at least track the weeks, predict the seasons to the month, and know when it's a new year and when it's a leap year. But to our ancestors living in the Stone Age, even a calendar wasn't a concept they could understand. This was back in a time when humans barely knew about the passage of the seasons. There were no term for week, month, or even year in their limited vocabulary. Farming hadn't been discovered yet, and we were still hooking up with Neanderthals.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck?
The average daily routine was just hunt, eat, and that. But even in these primitive times, there was still a need to keep track of the passage of days. See, because large game was scarce and hunts were highly unpredictable, during ovulation periods, the females in the group will have to be extra careful, since if a woman became pregnant when there wasn't enough food to go around, the chances that the child would survive would be pretty low. Nowadays, we have period tracking apps, and pills, and condoms, and skizzers, and abortion clinics, and adoption centers. So even though you still gotta be careful, accidents are pretty heavily insured. Back then, there was none of that. They didn't even have writing in those days, so abstinence was the only way. But for that to be effective, the women would have to know when they're ovulating by manually tracking their menstrual cycles. However, simply counting the days is not very reliable, since without a calendar, it's very easy to forget and lose track of how many days have passed. On top of that, arithmetic won't be invented for another few thousand years, so addition and subtraction of numbers anything larger than 10 was pretty much impossible for them. So how do they solve this problem? In the 1970s, deep in the Lubombo Mountains in southern Africa, a cave was found containing a particular prehistoric artifact, dating back over 40,000 years. It was a bone, thought to have originated from a baboon's fibula, with 29 notches scratched along its length. At first, there were multiple theories about what this could have been. Some people thought it could have been a utensil, like a serrated knife used for cutting meat and other foods. But it quickly became apparent that the size of the bone and also its thickness would have made it fairly impractical to use, especially as there were already better flint and stone tools around at the time. So then it was believed that it might have been a tally stick used for tracking menstrual cycles. And while that's a much better hypothesis, there were a few hints that suggested it probably wasn't the case, at least not directly. For one, menstrual cycles are 28 days on average, not 29. And they can also vary from cycle to cycle, so keeping a fixed count of 29 days would only be an approximation at best, and wouldn't really help in predicting ovulation or when the next period is going to be. However, there is another cycle that does correspond to number 29 exactly. If you looked up at the night sky on any given day and see a full moon, it'd take exactly 29 days for the moon to pass through all of its phases until you see a full moon again. This is known as the lunar cycle. So since tracking a fixed number of days doesn't really work for predicting ovulation, and also required arithmetic which wasn't invented yet, a much better way would be to first count the number of days in the lunar cycle using the bone tally, and then match that up with each phase of the moon. And by observing menstrual cycles over many lunar months, all that a woman would then have to do to tell if they're ovulating or not is simply look up at the night sky. So in a way, the moon itself was really our first ever calendar. But ovulation wasn't the only thing our ancestors tracked using the moon. There was actually a lot of other useful things too. For example, the length of a pregnancy is around 10 lunar months, beginning from the last bleed until birth. And for fishing, spring tides comes in twice every lunar month, providing the main protein source when there was a shortage of large game. Fast forward a few thousand years and humanity has reached the Neolithic era. This was when we first discovered how to farm crops and domesticate animals, instead of constantly needing to hunt for food. But farming brought a new kind of problem. See, in order to know when to plant seed so you can harvest the crops at the right time of year, as well as figuring out how much to plant so the yield is enough to survive on until the following harvest, the Neolithic people needed a reliable way to track the length of seasons. But with the 29-day lunar calendar, it's just not accurate enough. The first issue was that the calendar itself wasn't even all that stable. Turns out, 29 days is just a tad bit short of the actual length of a lunar month. The exact length was 29.53 days, which meant that every few months, the moon would seem to go out of phase. But no worries, just adding an extra day on the end of every other month. Problem solved, right? Well, it did work to make sure that the moon at least looked the same at the start of every month. I mean, sure, eventually the 0.03 days would add up to a full day, but by that point, people would have just reset their count on the next full moon or something like that and carried on from there. The bigger problem was that even with alternating 29 and 30-day months, that still only adds up to 354 days, a full 11 days short of a solar year. So if we look at the differences in seasons, for the solar year, each one lasts for 3 months exactly. But for the slightly shorter lunar year, even though it's close, they don't really match up with the start and end of the lunar months. So in a period of just 4 years, the seasons would have shifted forward by a whole month. That's a big deal when crops like wheat need to be planted at a fixed time each year to avoid things like disease risk, lower yields, and poor establishment. So if they wanted to feed themselves in the winter, they're going to have to fix up the calendar. Fast. So how do they do it? Well, the breakthrough moment came when one of the Neolithic men discovered that if you put a stick in the ground and mark the tip of the shadow every day at solar noon, over the course of a year, you draw out a straight line that goes up and down from north to south called a meridian line. On the day when the shadow is the shortest, the sun will be at its highest. That's the summer solstice. And when it reaches the north end, that's the winter solstice. This line exists because the Earth's axis is tilted, meaning that the sun sits at a different elevation depending on the month of the year. But to the Neolithic people, all they knew was that the number of days between one summer solstice to the next was 365 days for 3 years and 366 days for 1 year right after that, and the cycle repeats. Now the reason for the extra day is the same reason why we have our modern leap year. Basically, it has to do with the fact that the Earth's spin isn't quite aligned perfectly with our orbit around the sun. It's roughly off by around a quarter of a day, so that means that every 4 years it adds up to a full day. Now at the time, the discovery of the solstices was groundbreaking. It was ultimately what triggered the first agricultural revolution, separating us from the rest of the animal kingdom. With the ability to predict seasons, farm, and feed ourselves with the surplus of food, our brain size increased, making it possible for us to coordinate on an ever larger scale. The discovery of the year was so critical to survival, in fact, that early societies even built massive stone monuments specifically to mark the spot where the sun rose during the summer solstice. Even to this day, Stonehenge lets down its rope barriers each year and allows hundreds of visitors to gather around to watch the sunrise over the heel stone, cementing this millennia-long tradition and connecting us with our ancestors.